My name is Viva Lamore, and I have a few things to say about Chinatown in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
I adore being dressed in something frilly when my date comes to get me at my place. Out I go with my Joe or John or Billy, like a filly who is ready at the race.
The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is an amazing series that is sort of a fantasy of what it would be like to live in New York in the late 1950s, early 1960s. I mean, what New Yorker hasn't thought, oh my God, wouldn't it be amazing to be able to walk through Washington Square and run into Jane Jacobs having a rally?
Cities are made up of more than buildings and roads. People make up a city.
Or go to the Copacabana and listen to Tito Puente. Not to mention all the clothing. I mean, I want one of that, oh yeah. But when it comes to Chinatown, it seems that the writers did not do their homework.
So just to be clear, this is Chinatown.
Yes, this is Chinatown.
In season 3, episode 1, Joe Maisel rents a space in Chinatown and plans to turn it into a club.
You know what? I'll take it.
Okay, stop right there. First of all, Joe Maisel would never be able to rent a space in Chinatown because, as we all know, you can't rent a space in Chinatown unless you're Chinese. I've had super interesting discussions with people about how just about the only thing that stops gentrification in New York City is a really strong immigrant community. When you're talking about, say, the Polish people in Greenpoint, or you're talking about the Chinese in Chinatown, they don't let outsiders in. So that's why the neighborhood still retains its ethnic flavor. Still, to this day, the central part of Chinatown is all mafia run, and unless you're Chinese, they won't give you a lease. Okay, and people are going to be like, oh, no, you know, what about all the hipsters that are moving in, you know, onto the eastern part, in East Broadway and such? No, that was not Chinatown, actually. That area, just on East Broadway, that is all only Chinese since sometime in like the 80s, 90s. Before that, it was Jewish. That's Jewish. So the Chinese people don't really have that much of a history there, and that's why that area has been gentrifying. Meanwhile, the central part of old Chinatown, that is still completely Chinese. Okay, so let's say that Joe Maisel manages to get himself a space in Chinatown somehow. The biggest problem about the Chinatown in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is that everybody speaks Mandarin.
我希望你喜欢。
他要不要留下来？如果不要，我们死了合同，把案件退回。
This is such a disappointment. It erases so much of the character of Chinatown and so much of the history of Chinatown. I can't even begin. I mean, I know that I'm not the only one who's just like, what the hell? They're all speaking Mandarin. Mandarin and Cantonese are opposite poles. Mandarin is from the north. Cantonese is from the south. There's big antipathy between the north and the south in China, the same as there's big antipathy between the north and the south in the United States. Mandarin is flowery and sing-song and upper register. Cantonese is raw. People equate it with German, how it's kind of rough on the ears. You know, it sounds like that to me because I can't speak Cantonese. I grew up in New York City. I'm Taiwanese, so I speak some Mandarin, but I was never able to use my Mandarin. In fact, there are still some places in Chinatown that if you go in speaking Mandarin, they will look at you dirty. The Chinese that populated all of the historic Chinatowns in America came from Toisan and from the Canton area. Okay, so there's been so many books written about the history of the Chinese in America, but let me just give you a small, tiny little snapshot. The Chinese started to come to America in the 1850s as part of the gold rush, but there was so much anti-Chinese sentiment in the late 1800s that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. And this act basically prevented Asian people from coming to America until it was lifted in 1943. So we're talking about 1882 to 1943. It was really only about 100 Chinese people allowed into the country per year. So most of the population in Chinatown had been there for 2 or 3 generations. You're talking about a largely English-speaking group who would also speak some Cantonese and Cantonese. This only changed after 1965 with the Immigration Act of 1965 that got rid of the quotas, and suddenly there was this huge influx of new immigrants from everywhere, including new Asian immigrants. So now the Chinatown is full of people that mostly don't speak English. But at that time, in the 50s and 60s, they'd pretty much been there. I'm glad that in season 3, Mrs. Maisel has stopped being so darn white. But still, they gloss over so many things.
菜到东北菜到西，菜到西，菜炒姑娘笑眯眯。去年茶树茶花儿好，今年茶树叶满枝。
And can I just say something about racism and attitudes towards Asian people, even in New York City? Granted, I realize that the characters in Mrs. Maisel's are, for the most part, surprisingly progressive for their time period. But still, there was a lot of racism against Asian people. My father, who came to America in 1964, still recounted decades later his shock at being invited to the Russian tea room by some colleague and him getting all dressed up and all excited to go to the Russian tea room, only to find out that they wouldn't let him in. That existed. There was miscegenation laws in America until 1967. So an Asian woman and a white man, it would be looked on slightly askance. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I love that May is sassy and spicy and she speaks perfect English without an accent, thank God.
So what's the song about?
Well, it's the usual stuff. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, girl buys knife with 12-inch blade.
And I love that there's a gambling parlor in the basement of Joel's space. That actually is real. I actually worked in a secret underground go-go bar in Chinatown. But there's so many amazing things that could be depicted about 1950s, 60s Chinatown. If only the writers would just ask around. I mean, the show has so many other rich details about other neighborhoods, like, you know, Greenwich Village or like the Garment District. Why can't they do this about Chinatown? And can I say something about their swing dancing? Because it sucks. Okay, that's all I have to say about the marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Thank you for watching.